We have a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart. We're going to be talking about well water. Being from Maine, obviously this is something that I believe it's 40% of the population in Maine is on well water. So it's something that is unique to rural communities, and then compiled with the fact that Maine and a lot of New England is in the arsenic belt. So it's kind of a tricky thing to fully understand, but hopefully today we'll discuss everything well water. So yeah, we'll just kind of dive right into it. So I linked a EPA article that kind of goes into the different types of wells. So there's like a dug well, there's a driven well, there's a bunch of different types of wells that are unique to your specific home. So so it really depends, when your home was built, how the well was dug, that type of thing. But there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot more than just kind of digging a hole and then getting water from your well. You need a pump, you need a casing, you need a lot of different technologies that make it, an actual drinking water system. So with that being said, wells are really susceptible to a lot of different contaminants that public drinking water systems are often susceptible to. And like I mentioned at the beginning, arsenic is definitely at the top of that list. Like I said, in Maine, it's a really, really big problem. We have some of the highest bladder cancer rates in the country, and this is because bladder cancer is associated with arsenic exposure. And a lot of people don't actually know the extent of the arsenic levels in their private well. Because when you buy a house that's on a private well, you get that initial test that's like 5 contaminants, and then it kind of like checks a box for the realtor, and then you're on your merry way. Good morning, Michael. So that's kind of all that people really think about. They think, okay, my well passed this initial inspection from the realtor, I'm good to go in perpetuity. And that's just simply not the case. So some of the susceptibilities are obviously runoff from, a nearby road or a nearby industry, anything like that. In Michigan, actually, one of the Pfas manufacturers, we'll get into Pfas in a second, Wolverine Incorporated or whatever that is, this family lived just directly across the street from this Pfas manufacturing facility, and they were on a private well, and they have still to date some of the highest levels of Pfas that have been recorded in the US. So yeah, that being said, arsenic is really what people initially think of when they think of a private well contaminant. So we had a customer that came to us about probably 3 or 4 months ago, and they had arsenic levels that were over twice as high as EPA standard. So it was 23.9 parts per billion. And the current EPA standard is 10 parts per billion, but this is kind of not a health standard. It's just kind of a regulatory standard that's attainable by municipalities. So that's an important nuance to the 10 part per billion standard. So their arsenic levels were super, super high. And luckily Hydroviv brought the arsenic levels down to undetected. That being said, those arsenic levels changed over time. So when this individual bought the house, arsenic was in compliance, it was under the 10 parts per billion. And then that level can actually change over time with natural weathering of the bedrock and just general wear and tear on the groundwater and just the hydrology of the well. So, yeah, that was we were really, really fortunate to see those results from the arsenic removal. And in that person's same well, they also had extremely high uranium levels. So the well had 235 parts per billion of uranium, which is 7 times higher than EPA's federal standard for uranium. So again, just because when you purchase your home, if that box is checked that like your well is good, it's just not enough to kind of move on and never get it checked again. Like, you have to kind of keep an eye on things and get more than just that like 5 contaminant check, because it just doesn't really show you the whole scope of what could actually be in your well water. So yeah, we mentioned PFAS earlier with the Wolverine facility in Michigan. And this is kind of also something that is slipping under the radar a little bit. I see Beth is on Instagram Live right now, and she has been a huge advocate for PFAS in North Carolina drinking water, specifically like the Wilmington area, because they had a huge issue, still dealing with the issue with Gen X and other PFAS in the Cape Fear River in a public water supply. Also, with that being said, the private side of PFAS is something that's not generally all that talked about. So at this like PFAS facility, oh yes, Christina found the Wolverine Worldwide article. Thank you so much for doing that. Yeah, so that kind of talks about the neighbor of the facility that was producing PFAS and their extremely high levels. We actually highlighted the woman that lives across the street, because she just got diagnosed with, I believe, thyroid cancer. So yes, back to the PFAS in North Carolina. So this facility, this Chemours facility, was polluting the Cape Fear River, but they were also polluting nearby groundwater and nearby just like soil, dumping things, wherever. And private wells were actually starting to pop positive for PFAS. So Chemours then instituted this free filter for people who live within a 9-mile radius. Well, what do you know? PFAS travels much further than 9 miles through groundwater. So people outside of that 9-mile radius weren't really testing their wells. They weren't really like part of this whole initiative to reduce PFAS levels. So that being said, PFAS can travel extremely long distances. They don't really break down in the environment. So the fact that PFAS were detected 9 miles and further away from this facility, it really goes to show that, groundwater can travel quickly, and it can disperse different contaminants throughout an entire aquifer into people's different wells. So next, we'll just kind of go into lead a little bit. So corrosive groundwater can actually make your pipes more susceptible to leaching. And this, might sound obvious, because we know that in public municipal water, if the water is corrosive, there's a higher likelihood of lead that's going to leach into the public supply, and that's why we add corrosion control inhibitors like orthophosphate, or we try to change the pH of water. But it's not really something that people talk about with private wells, just because water corrosivity isn't really tested for, and it's not really something that people would even think that would affect their levels of lead. So USGS actually has a really, really good map, and I believe that it's in the link, or in the article that I linked in our bio, of areas of the country with corrosive groundwater. And this map is fascinating because it's actually more prevalent than you might initially think. So definitely check that out. If it's not linked, I will link it when I'm done with the live. But yeah, if your house is built before 1986, even if you're on a private well, you probably used lead pipes and lead plumbing, and the corrosivity of the groundwater can definitely impact the lead levels in your house. So now we'll kind of talk about the regulatory side of private wells. And when I was, growing up in Maine, you don't really ask your parents like, hey, is our well regulated? Is our well safe? Like, what does safe actually mean? So it wasn't really until college that I actually learned kind of the nuances and really how private well owners are entirely on their own for determining the safety of their water. So private wells are not required to meet any type of regulatory requirements. So, the government or a state EPA or state Department of Environmental Protection, whoever it is not coming to your house and saying, hey, let's check your well. Like that just doesn't happen. It's not the same as a public system where there are standards that the utility has to meet. It's just not like that. You're completely on your own. You're completely on your own for testing. You're completely on your own for removing contaminants. So that was kind of startling to me. Just being from a state where wells are so prevalent and wondering, like, does everybody know this? Does everybody know that you're really on your own for determining what you're actually putting into your body? As always, if you live on a private well and you're curious about some of the contaminants that might be there, we have scientists running our live chat, so you can ask any questions that you might have about your well or about groundwater in general, and we'd be more than happy to answer.